Jake Monroe had always believed that the best things in life were earned, not given. After nearly 3 decades working construction across the Midwest, saving every extra dollar and living well below his means, he finally decided it was time to settle down. He wasn't looking for luxury or city lights. He wanted solitude, nature, and something that felt truly his. That's when he found the old cabin by Whispering Pines Lake. The listing had been vague. Fixer-upper on quiet, secluded property, lakefront view, A-size. But Jake had seen the photos. Rough-hewn wood, an overgrown path down to the water, and a roof that looked like it hadn't been touched since the Reagan administration. To most people, it would be a money pit. To Jake, it was perfect. He made the offer in cash, closed the deal in under a week, and drove up the winding 2-lane road with his dog Max riding shotgun. The air was clean. The lake shimmered like glass. And nestled between a line of pine trees was the cabin, worn down, leaning slightly but still standing proud against the shoreline like a stubborn old man refusing to move. The first few weeks were pure labor. Jake replaced beams, stripped out rotted floorboards, and patched up the chimney. The cabin didn't have modern insulation or central heating, but Jake didn't care. He was used to work. There was a deep sense of satisfaction in watching the place come back to life, board by board, like waking up something that had been asleep too long. What he hadn't anticipated was how quickly the area around him was changing. About a mile away, a new subdivision had been under development. Dozens of identical homes with white fences, trimmed lawns, and cheery little flags waving in the wind. It was called Whispering Pines Estates, and despite sharing a name with the lake, the people, there seemed more interested in uniformity than nature. Jake didn't think much of them until a few residents began walking near his land, peering at his cabin like it didn't belong. At first it was just a few polite hellos. Then came the flyers. One day Jake found a glossy envelope tucked into the screen door. "Welcome to the neighborhood," it read. Inside was an invitation to join the newly formed Whispering Pines Lakefront HOA. There were promises of lake beautification, projects, community events, and a proposed walking trail that would enhance recreational access to all residents. Jake chuckled and tossed the letter onto the workbench. He hadn't bought into an HOA. His deed clearly stated he owned his land outright, going back decades before the subdivision was even a concept. Besides, he had no intention of joining anything. He wanted peace, not politics. Still, the visitors kept coming. Once a sharply dressed man knocked on his door, said he was the HOA president, introduced himself as Rick Caldwell, polished shoes, crisp shirt, and the kind of overconfident smile that said he was used to being in charge. Rick complimented Jake on the rustic look of his cabin and hinted that it would be great if he could clean up the shoreline a bit for the community. Jake didn't bother being polite. He told Rick that the land was private, always had, been, and would stay that way. Rick left with a thin smile and a promise that, "We'll be in touch." Jake didn't like the tone. The weather turned colder, and Jake spent most of his time finishing up the inside of the cabin, installing a wood stove, sealing the windows, and carving a path down to a small dock he built by hand. The lake was stunning in winter, silent, still, and wrapped in mist most mornings. It was everything he'd hoped for, until the day he left for town to get supplies and came back to find a bulldozer in his front yard. His stomach dropped when he saw the smoke. Not fire, diesel exhaust. Machines were digging up the path to his dock. Workers in hard hats were spray painting the ground and laying out survey flags. And worse, his cabin, his home, was completely gone. Flattened, splintered wood lay in a heap where his porch once stood. Max growled. Jake stood frozen, numb, and disbelieving. A man with a clipboard approached, asking if he was the property caretaker. Jake didn't answer. He couldn't. That was when he saw the sign. Future site of the Whispering Pines Lake Path. Brought to you by your HOA. Something snapped inside him. They didn't ask. They didn't check. They just assumed. But Jake knew something they didn't. He had the papers, the deed, and the law on his side. They thought he was just some recluse squatting on common property. They were dead wrong. Jake stared at the flattened remains of his cabin, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. It was impossible to believe. Only days ago he had sat on the porch sipping coffee, listening to the wind roll across the lake. Now the spot where he'd built his dock, repaired the railing and stacked firewood for winter was nothing but a mess of twisted boards and tire tracks. A young worker in a reflective vest stepped toward him, clipboard in hand, chewing gum like this was just another Tuesday. "Sir, can I help you?" Jake didn't say a word. He couldn't trust himself to speak yet. Max barked once, sharply, breaking the eerie quiet. The worker glanced at the dog and took a step back. Jake finally found his voice. "What the hell is going on here?" The worker shifted uncomfortably and pointed toward the sign by the road. "Construction for the HOA's new lake path. You're on community land, sir. We had the go-ahead." "Go-ahead from who?" Jake snapped. "This is my land. That was my cabin." Before the worker could respond, a black SUV pulled up. Out stepped Rick Caldwell, the same smug HOA president who'd visited a few weeks back. He walked toward Jake like nothing was out of the ordinary, sunglasses perched on his head and that same irritating half-smile glued to his face. "Ah, Mr. Monroe," Rick said cheerfully, spreading his hands like he was welcoming an old friend. "Glad you're here. Bit of a misunderstanding, I think." Jake took a slow step forward. "You demolished my home." Rick gave a light chuckle. "Well, technically it was an unpermitted structure on what's now designated HOA property. We filed the plans with the county, posted notice." Jake cut him off. "There was no notice and this isn't HOA property." Rick tilted his head, amused. "With respect, I don't think you understand how the land was reassessed when the subdivision was incorporated. The Shoreline falls under community jurisdiction now. You should have gotten the letters. Multiple ones, actually. We tried to contact you." Jake stared at him, hardly believing what he was hearing. "I have a deed. You think a bunch of flyers and surveys override a legal title?" Rick's expression hardened, just a little. "Look, we don't want a legal battle. Let's not make this messy. Maybe we can work something out, some sort of community use agreement. You'll still have lake access. In fact, once the trail is finished, you'll have one of the best views in the subdivision." Jake laughed, a bitter, incredulous sound. "You really think I'm going to negotiate with the people who tore down my house without permission?" Rick shrugged. "The HOA has broad authority over shared spaces. It's all in the charter." "I never signed your charter." There was a pause. Rick didn't like that. Jake could see it. The moment the man realized he might have made a mistake. But he was still trying to bluff his way through it. "Well," Rick said, straightening his posture, "we'll have to let the lawyers sort it out then." "You're damn right we will," Jake growled. He turned and walked back to his truck, heart pounding, Max trotting beside him with his ears flat and tail low. Jake didn't stop shaking until he got home, his real home, which now existed only in photos and memory. The next morning he drove 2 counties over to the clerk's office and pulled the original property documents. Sure enough, the land had been deeded to him directly. 6 acres of wooded shoreline with unrestricted usage rights, including the HOA area now occupied by the HOA's fancy new clubhouse and half their precious trail. The subdivision had been built adjacent to his land, not over it. But somewhere along the way, someone had decided to redraw a few lines, quietly, unofficially, and illegally. Jake spent the rest of the day calling real estate lawyers. The third one he reached actually listened. "Wait," the attorney said, slowly, after Jake laid it all out. "They demolished a structure on your land without a court order or verified ownership?" Jake confirmed. "Good Lord," the man said. "That's not just a lawsuit. That's trespass, destruction of property, and possibly criminal mischief." Jake hung up after making arrangements to meet in person. He felt something he hadn't felt since the day the cabin went up in flames. Hope. Real, solid hope. The HOA thought they could do what they wanted because they had money, signatures, and printed signs. But they didn't have the law. And they, sure as hell, didn't have Jake Monroe's permission. They thought they'd built a walking trail. What they'd really done was pave their way straight into the courtroom. The manila folder felt heavier than it should have. Inside, it held the keys to everything: the deed, the survey maps, the plat descriptions. Jake sat at the small-town law office of Charles Whitaker, a silver-haired attorney with decades of real estate experience and a temperament as steady as bedrock. The walls were lined with framed diplomas and old photos of Charles standing with state judges and realtors from across the county. Charles peered through a pair of reading glasses, flipping through Jake's paperwork slowly, methodically. The silence in the room was almost unbearable. Finally, the attorney leaned back in his chair and exhaled through his nose. "This is clean. Original deed from 1957. Recorded and uncontested. Ownership of 6¼ acres, including 1,000 feet of lakefront shoreline. Not one mention of a shared right-of-way or HOA overlay." Jake leaned forward. "And that includes the land where their clubhouse is sitting now?" Charles nodded. "Yes, sir. Not only that, it looks like the HOA's entire lake trail runs straight across your property for a solid quarter-mile. Their development is adjacent, but it never legally extended onto your land. No easements, no legal access, nothing." Jake sat back, a slow-burning anger beginning to solidify into something colder, sharper. "So how'd they think they could do this?" Charles gave a half shrug. "Because they assumed. That's the problem with these associations. They think their internal rules mean more than the law. They probably saw that your cabin wasn't on the county GIS maps and figured it was abandoned or encroaching. But what they should have done was pull the deeds, which they didn't." Jake let out a bitter laugh. "So I'm not crazy." "Not at all," Charles said. "In fact, I'd say you've got a hell of a case. What they did wasn't just presumptuous, it was illegal. They trespassed, destroyed private property, and developed land they didn't own. And the best part?" He smiled faintly. "They didn't even try to cover their tracks. The trail construction, the clubhouse, the HOA meeting minutes, they've documented everything they did." Jake's thoughts turned to Rick Caldwell and his smug attitude, the casual way he dismissed Jake's ownership as a misunderstanding. That was no misunderstanding. It was arrogance. Charles continued, "We'll send a demand letter first. They'll try to fight it. But once we file the lawsuit and notify their insurance carrier, they'll start sweating. You're looking at damages for the demolished structure, punitive damages for willful trespassing, and possibly even an injunction to stop them from using their own clubhouse." Jake raised an eyebrow. "I can shut down their clubhouse? If it's on your land, you can do a lot more than that. You can revoke access, fence off the shoreline, even charge rent if you feel generous. But personally," Charles grinned, "I wouldn't feel generous." Jake didn't either. That afternoon, Charles began drafting the legal paperwork. Jake drove back to what was left of his property. The path the HOA had bulldozed through his yard was already being graveled over. Orange cones and plastic barriers lined the sides, and a small crew was installing lampposts and signage. He parked his truck and stepped out, arms folded. Rick Caldwell spotted him from the other side of the trail and made a show of walking over with exaggerated politeness. "Jake," he said with faux concern, "I heard you've been consulting with a lawyer. Look, I really think you're overreacting. This is about community, not conflict." Jake didn't respond at first. He just looked Rick in the eyes, calm and deliberate. "Your clubhouse," Jake said quietly, "is on my land." Rick blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" "I pulled the deed. The survey, all of it. The clubhouse, the trail, everything, on my land. And now it's a legal issue." Rick's face twitched slightly, the corners of his mouth pulling downward. "Let's be reasonable." Jake smiled. "I'm being very reasonable. You've got until the end of the week to stop all work and vacate the area. My lawyer's sending a cease and desist letter, and we'll see you in court after that." Rick looked like he wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. He turned and walked back toward the construction zone, his steps quicker now, his back a little less straight. Jake stood there for another minute, watching. He thought of all the hours he spent restoring the cabin, the quiet mornings, the meals on the porch with Max. The cabin may be gone, but the land was still his. And that land was about to speak louder than any HOA rulebook ever could. He placed a new sign in the ground beside the gravel path. Private property. Trespassers will be prosecuted. This time, there would be no misunderstandings. The courthouse steps echoed under Jake's boots as he climbed them 2 at a time, the same steady fire in his chest that had burned since the day his cabin was reduced to rubble. Charles Whitaker walked beside him, carrying a thick binder of documents, evidence, maps, photos, letters, and most importantly, the original deed. They'd filed the lawsuit the week before, and already the local media had caught wind of it. A private landowner suing an HOA for destroying his cabin and illegally building on his land? That kind of story didn't stay quiet for long. Jake didn't care about publicity. He cared about justice. Inside the courtroom, the HOA's legal team had already assembled. Rick Caldwell sat at the front of the gallery, now noticeably less smug. He looked uncomfortable in a suit, the kind of man used to board meetings and brunch, not legal proceedings. Jake took his seat without even glancing in Rick's direction. Judge Maloney, a stern but fair middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense tone, entered and reviewed the case file. When she saw the before and after photographs of Jake's cabin, she paused for a long time. The image of the once-standing cabin followed by the pile of splintered debris was stark. I see the defendants proceeded with demolition and construction without a verified title or court order, she said, frowning. This will be a very interesting case. The courtroom grew tense. Over the next hour, Charles laid everything out. The deed from 1957 showing Jake's full ownership of the land, the lack of any easement, right-of-way, or transfer to the HOA. A copy of the HOA's own trail construction proposal showing the path running directly through Jake's property. Testimonies from nearby residents who'd heard heavy machinery on the site. Even photos of the HOA's clubhouse, with landscaping and lake access stairs, built smack in the middle of Jake's shoreline. Jake listened silently. He didn't need to say much. The document spoke louder than any outrage could. The HOA's lawyer, a younger man in a sleek navy suit, tried to argue that the land had been reassessed for community benefit during the subdivision's development, but he couldn't explain how no legal transfer had occurred. He fumbled when asked to produce documentation proving the HOA's ownership of the land in question. The judge leaned forward. So you're telling me your client demolished a home and built on land they did not legally own, based on an assumption and some internal maps? The attorney stammered. We believed, based on the subdivision plans, that the shoreline had been designated for communal access. The judge cut him off. Belief is not ownership. A mistake of that magnitude is not excusable. It's reckless. Rick shrank in his seat. The room was silent. The judge ordered a temporary injunction, halting all HOA development on Jake's land, including use of the clubhouse and the trail. She made it clear that further use would be considered trespassing. The final hearing would determine damages, but even at this early stage, the HOA's position was unraveling fast. Outside the courthouse, reporters hovered like bees around a shaken hive. Jake gave a short, quiet statement. I didn't ask for this fight, but I'm going to finish it. They tore down my home. They thought I was just one man. Turns out one man with the law on his side is enough. The clip went viral within hours. Local stations aired segments showing the rogue HOA versus the wronged cabin owner. Online, people chimed in with their own HOA horror stories. Sympathy flooded in, offers of support, even donations to help Jake rebuild. Meanwhile, Whispering Pines Estates faced backlash. Residents demanded answers. Board members resigned. The subdivision's image was tarnished overnight. Rick tried to save face, calling an emergency meeting, spinning the narrative as a community miscommunication. But the damage was done. Residents, especially those who didn't want HOA fees funding lawsuits, were furious. Jake watched it all unfold from the hilltop where his cabin once stood. The shoreline was quiet again. No workers, no bulldozers, just wind in the trees and water lapping against the rocks. He stood with Max at his side, sipping coffee from a thermos, thinking not of revenge, but of restoration. The law was on his side now. The truth was public. And soon, he'd not only rebuild his home, he'd reclaim every inch of what they tried to steal, because they hadn't just bulldozed a cabin. They bulldozed the wrong man's land. The morning mist hovered over the lake like a veil as Jake walked the trail that had once been paved over without his consent. Now, it was silent, overgrown in places, with orange construction markers dangling uselessly from branches and half-buried signs peeking through the grass. Max trotted ahead, ears perked, tail wagging gently. It had been 6 months since the court's final ruling and everything had changed. The judge's verdict was devastating. For the HOA, they were ordered to pay full restitution for the demolished cabin, including sentimental value, which the judge noted was clearly significant given the defendant's history and the nature of the property. They were fined for trespassing, and a separate civil suit, filed with Jake's permission, was opened against the construction contractors who had failed to verify the ownership lines. More importantly, the HOA was ordered to vacate all structures and improvements built on Jake's land, including the lakefront clubhouse. That was the final blow. The judge gave them 90 days to dismantle it. By the end of that period, Rick Caldwell had resigned, citing stress and public pressure. The new HOA board members had been elected on promises of reform and humility. One of their first acts was to send Jake a formal letter of apology, signed by all 8 board members, along with an offer to cover reconstruction costs and rebuild what was taken. Jake never replied. He didn't want their money. He wanted distance. Instead, he partnered with a local independent builder, someone who didn't wear loafers or speak in real estate jargon. The new cabin was simple, sturdy and beautiful. A-frame design with a metal roof, cedar siding, and large lake-facing windows. It wasn't the same as the old one, and it didn't try to be. It was its own thing, stronger, wiser, and built on ground now secured by ironclad legal lines. The land had been resurveyed and re-recorded with the county. A thick steel post now marked the property boundary near the old clubhouse site, which was now nothing more than a patch of dirt. Jake had the rubble cleared, and then let wildflowers take over. That felt like justice. Every so often, HOA members would pass by during walks, always staying on the right side of the boundary. Some would nod quietly, others would offer awkward hellos. Jake returned only the respectful ones. There were still murmurs in the community. Some residents blamed the old board. Others grumbled about rising dues from the lawsuit costs, but most had come to accept the simple truth. They'd pushed too far and they picked the wrong person to bully. Jake had never wanted a fight. He had only wanted his peace, his corner of the world by the water, the place his grandfather had once fished, the land his father had loved, the cabin he'd rebuilt after a hard year with his own hands and a dream of solitude. They'd mistaken his silence for weakness. But now, Jake stood on the shore, looking out over the lake with a quiet sense of triumph. Not the kind that comes with gloating or headlines, but the deeper kind, earned, rooted. The kind that comes from standing your ground and refusing to be erased. He sat on the new porch, Max curled at his feet, a fresh cup of coffee steaming in his hands. Across the water, the community clubhouse was gone. The lampposts along the trail were gone. The trail itself was now a dead end, ending awkwardly just before the boundary line. He had reclaimed what was his. The land, the quiet, the dignity. A soft breeze stirred the trees, and for the first time in a long time, Jake smiled without bitterness. There would be no more threats, no more bulldozers, no more men in polos talking about community improvements while holding clipboards over people's rights. Just him, the lake, and the life they tried to steal, now fully his again. It turned out the HOA never really understood what ownership meant. They saw land as leverage. Jake saw it as legacy, and now they knew the difference.